Good evening, everybody. We're back to the fall and we're doing meetings again. We kind of skipped the summer here in the Ken Keltner chapter, and so it's good to have a chapter meeting and to see some of your faces. And I'm sure you guys are just thrilled to see mine too. But tonight is at Saber 52 up in Minnesota. My favorite presentation was about the 10-cent beer night. It was interesting. It was funny. It was, it was just a very good presentation. So I made it known that I have to talk to Vince. I want to see if I can get him to do a chapter meeting. And all of a sudden, some guy I didn't recognize him said, "Hey, you want to talk to me?" I said, "Oh, sure." I was, "About what?" So Vince saw me before I saw him. So we set it up then to do this, and the advantage that we have tonight is Vince can do more than just the 20-minute Saber convention meeting length. He'll add some other stuff to it to make it even more interesting. So I'm looking forward. So welcome, Vince.
Well,
Real,
thanks for having me. It is
you bet. The real quick intro here. This summer marked the 50th anniversary of the 10-cent beer night in Cleveland. And although a popular promotion within the major and minor league, something went wrong in 1974, and he's going to let us know what it is. Vince is an award-winning journalist whose writing also appears regularly in various regional and national magazines and online publications. A native of Youngstown and a graduate of Bowling Green University, he is the author of 3 books on Ohio's sports history. He is the treasurer for the Jack Graney chapter in Cleveland. So, Vince, before we get started, I have a question for you.
Hit me.
What's your earliest baseball memory?
My earliest baseball memory is probably sitting in the living room of our house when I was a kid and watching the Indians on Channel 43. It was not Len Barker's perfect game. I will tell you that much. I was 3 years old. I didn't watch it. I wasn't at it, but this is actually a really good jumping off point because I'm going to start with the words of John Adams, who was the guy who played the drum at Cleveland Stadium and at Jacobs Field. You heard him for years and years and years, and he actually was a 10-cent beer night. And he said that down through the years, 720,000 people have told me they were at 10-cent beer night. And he said, and 820,000 people told him they were at Len Barker's perfect game. Barker's perfect game, the actual attendance, I want to say, was somewhere around 7,000. It was a cold, rainy, miserable night in early May. 10-cent beer night was a little better attended than that. I think the crowd there was up over 25,000, which was a great crowd for a Tuesday night, and we'll go into that a little more. But we're going to actually start in the 40s. In 1948, the Cleveland Indians won the World Series. This photo is one of my favorites. It was taken on the day that the Indians were mathematically eliminated from pennant contention in 1949. And that day, the gates opened onto the field at Cleveland Stadium, and a horse-drawn hearse came out. And the hearse processed very slowly out into the outfield. And they very solemnly lowered the pennant and placed it in a casket and buried the casket in the dirt at Cleveland Stadium. The pennant's never been found. There were actually lots and lots of theories that when they bulldozed Cleveland Stadium in the 90s, that they might have actually bulldozed it into the lake. But we do know that it was dug up. And we know it was dug up because I want to say, actually right around the time of 10-cent beer night, I think 74, 75, they had an event for the 48 team, brought them all back. And in one of the stories covering it, one of the groundskeepers for the team said that they dug up the casket that night because Bill Veeck, who's obviously shown here presiding over the funeral, because Bill Veeck borrowed the casket from a local funeral home and they wanted it back. In 1948, the Indians won the World Series. In 1949, they finished out of the money. It was a very tight pennant race that year between the Yankees and the Red Sox. Into the 50s, the Indians kept finishing second to the Yankees. won the pennant in 1954, won a record 111 games, and of course got swept in the World Series by the Giants. And that started a long, slow slide into mediocrity for the team for a generation. And in fact, it got to the point where the Indians' future in Cleveland was very tenuous. They were one of the teams that was very actively courted by Minneapolis in the 1950s. I wrote an article for the National Pastime at the Minneapolis Convention about all those teams. There was the Giants, there was the Indians, and obviously there was the Senators who ended up making that move. The team was also rumored to be headed to Seattle in the 1960s. And that is where this picture was taken. This picture was taken in 1964 when they finally agreed on a new lease for Cleveland Stadium. This guy right here is Vernon Stouffer, he of the microwave pizzas and macaroni and cheese. This is the mayor of Cleveland, and you can't really make him out here, but that is Gabe Paul, who worked for the Indians on several different occasions. Actually worked for quite a few major league teams. But there weren't a lot of people turning out to see the Indians, to the point that in 1964, the Cleveland Browns won the NFL championship. And in 9 home dates, they actually outdrew the Indians that year. It got to the point where the business community was urging support for the team because they viewed the team as a civic asset. In 1973, opening day accounted for more than 10% of the team's total attendance. I don't know if you guys have ever been to Cleveland Stadium. Cleveland Stadium was enormous, and this was always the way it was. It would get a full crowd or very close to a full crowd for opening day, and then would struggle to draw after that. We were talking about my earliest memory. I can remember watching the Indians in the 80s, and you could actually hear the beer vendors and the ships out on Lake Erie because the crowd was so quiet at Cleveland Stadium. Again, I come back to the words of John Adams, who said that there was a joke in Cleveland in the 70s. A fan called and asked, "What time is the Indians game tonight?" And the Indians said, "Well, what time can you get here?" And the Indians actually had a deal in place. Vernon Stouffer actually made a deal to play, I think it was 40 home games at the new dome in New Orleans when construction was completed on that. Vernon Stouffer ended up selling the team in the early 1970s. He actually turned down George Steinbrenner, who is a Cleveland native, who tried to buy the Indians unsuccessfully. Ended up selling to Nick Milletti, who actually just passed on, I want to say within the last month or so. And one of the first things Milletti did was cancel the agreement to play in New Orleans. But it was still a hard go to draw fans, so they had to get really creative in their promotions because people obviously were not coming out for the baseball team. Carl Wallenda walked across a tightrope strung across the roof of Cleveland Stadium. And I don't know about you guys, but just thinking about that makes me want to go lie down on the floor. That actually happened on the Friday before 10-cent beer night. Evel Knievel made an appearance at the stadium. He didn't jump over any trucks or buses like he's doing in this picture at a racetrack in Northeast Ohio. But he did ride his motorcycle around the inside of the stadium. And Milt Wilcox, who was a pitcher for the Indians at the time, said that Evel Knievel had so many broken bones and things like that Milt actually had to kickstart his motorcycle for him. The King and his Court softball exhibition played. Dick Bosman, who was on the Indians for 10-cent beer night and actually threw a no-hitter for the Indians later on that season, said he was very disappointed because he had to answer questions after the no-hitter, and he was missing the King and his Court exhibition after the game. My personal favorite is on Mother's Day in 1971 when all the fans in attendance got a free can of Right Guard deodorant. That's obviously a very functional present, but I'm not sure that that's what you want to go for at a ball game. And of course, there were beer nights. There were 4 beer nights that were scheduled in 1974. The first scheduled for June 4th. And it's an appropriate tradition because beer and baseball have a long-standing relationship. There was a league in the late 1800s that was nicknamed the Beer and Whiskey League because it was populated by ruffians. In the early 1900s, a band by the name of Harry Stevens standardized the ballpark menu. He actually had concessions. He started out in the minor leagues. He was an Englishman who ended up in Northeast Ohio, and he started out doing scorecards and concessions in Columbus. And from there, he grew into the National League. And then when the American League started, he kind of branched out. And it was very fortuitous that the American League had a lot of the same, teams in a lot of the same cities as the National League did. So he could just move over there. And he standardized the menu that we really have come to know even to this day. Hot dogs, peanuts, ice cream, and of course, beer. There was when he died, one of the obituaries said that Harry Stevens parlayed a bag of peanuts into $1 million fortune. I have an ad here from Blatt's Beer with Bill Veeck. Before Bill Veeck owned the Indians, he owned the Milwaukee Brewers when they were a minor league team. And in the Hustler's Handbook, he tells one of my favorite baseball stories. He talked about how the two big breweries in Milwaukee when he owned the Brewers were Schlitz and Blatt's. And so he made a deal with Miller. And Miller's a big name now. Miller was not a big name then. And Miller was going to provide beer at the ballpark for him. Well, the United States was getting into World War II, and one of the things that happened when the United States got into World War II is there was rationing, and there was rationing of a variety of things. There was rationing of tires and paper and gasoline, but there was also rationing of food like meat and grain. And grain, of course, is one of the main ingredients in beer. And Bill Veeck said that people would come to the ballpark just to drink the beer. And Miller said, hey, do we have to make all the beer we sell you? Because they were subject to grain rationing as well. Or can we contract with others? And Bill Veeck said, you can, as long as you deliver it to me, I don't care who makes it. And so he said in his book that a whole bunch of fly-by-night operations came and started supplying beer. And he said, and right after the war, I'm sure they all went right back to making shampoo. After his time in Cleveland, Bill Veeck also owned the St. Louis Browns. And there was a time that it seemed like if a team was going to leave St. Louis, it was going to be the Cardinals. The Cardinals were in dire financial straits. Their owner was going to prison for tax evasion, and he was, let's say, a motivated seller. The buyer ended up being Anheuser-Busch, and Bill Veeck read the writing on the wall and said, I cannot compete with their deep pockets. And Anheuser-Busch said, we want to name the stadium Budweiser Park. And Major League Baseball told them they couldn't do that. They couldn't name their stadium after a product, never mind about beer. And he said, well, what about Wrigley Field? They said, that's named for the family that owns the team. And they said, okay, well, how about Busch Stadium? And they said, okay, we can do that because that's your name. And then 3 years later, Anheuser-Busch introduces Busch Mountain Spring Beer, which is still made today. So beer has always been a very big part of the baseball experience. And if there's one thing that I want you guys to all take from this, it's that 10-cent beer night or productions or promotions of that ilk were very popular. Many teams did it. The Brewers did it. The Astros did it. The Twins did it. A lot of minor league teams did it as well. And it was and it was a very popular promotion. And since I'm doing this on my computer, I have a chance to do this now. This is a game that was a week before 10-cent beer night between the Indians and the Rangers in Texas. And up here, we've got Lenny Randle coming up to bat. And he's coming up to bat against Milt Wilcox. And the Indians had won the game the night before, and Milt Wilcox said that before the game, Gaylord Perry said, if I was pitching tonight, Lenny Randle would go down every time he came up to bat. I wouldn't hit him, but I would knock him down. Because apparently in that morning's paper, Lenny Randle popped off and said Gaylord Perry was washed up. And if it wasn't for him throwing the spitter, he probably still wouldn't be in baseball. And so that is the background on this. Like I said, this is Lenny Randle up to bat against Milt Wilcox. And there's Milt Wilcox throwing behind Lenny Randle, who then lays down a bunt and just absolutely trucks Milt Wilcox as he's trying to cover first. And obviously a fight breaks out. And if you are a baseball fan, you know that baseball fights aren't that big a deal. I talked to several players that were involved in this, and they said this was a real knockdown, drag-out fight. I mean, this was, people were actually hitting each other, and they were mad at each other. And we'll skip ahead a little bit because apparently the fans were starting to get in on it. That is Dave Duncan, who is trying to go into the stands before some of his teammates were calling him back into the dugout. Now we will go back to the PowerPoint. I'm really excited that I was able to do that. That's the first time I've been able to make that video work. I'm very, very excited about that. And after the game, Billy Martin was asked if there were going to be any reprisals the following week in Cleveland. And I know that you were all very literate baseball fans, so I feel like I can tell you this. He said that there weren't going to be enough fans to worry about in Cleveland. And obviously, there were a lot of people there who were really itching to prove him wrong. Put that out. Oh, wait. We'll hang on a second. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulties. We'll get right back to where we were. And obviously, Billy Martin said there won't be enough people in Cleveland to worry about. And there were a lot of people who took umbrage to that, not the least of which was this guy, Pete Franklin. He is the spiritual descendant of every hot take artist that you see on Sports Talk now. He was a radio host on 3WE in Cleveland, an AM superstation that bragged that they could be heard in 38 states and half of Canada. Pete Franklin's autobiography was called "You Could Argue, But You'd Be Wrong." He was the guy who, when the Yankees came to town, engineered "I Hate the Yankees, Hankies," which is really a sentiment that I think we can all get behind. And he is probably best well known in Cleveland for his feud with Ted Stepien, the hilariously inept owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers. Ted Stepien hated Pete Franklin so much that he actually moved the Cavs radio station from 3WE because of him. At one point, it appeared that Ted Stepien was going to move the Cavaliers to Toronto in the early 80s. And he went on a radio show in Toronto to promote it. And they took a call from a listener, and it was Pete Franklin. And they didn't know it was Pete Franklin, who introduced himself and said, "Am I talking to the dumbest man in pro sports?" And the conversation kind of went downhill from there. So Pete was one of a very loud chorus of people who are getting players, or who are getting audiences fired up about the Rangers coming to town the following week. And I want to talk a minute about the Texas Rangers as well, because the Rangers' fate at that point was almost as bad as the Indians. I mentioned that the Washington Senators moved to Minnesota and became the Twins. A second team was put in Washington, also called the Senators. And they were bought by Bob Short, who had no real tie to the DC area. And so he moved the team to the Dallas area. The move was met with some displeasure in Washington, D.C., and a forfeit. There were three great forfeits in the 1970s related to essentially fan riots on the field. The first one was the Senators' last game against the Yankees. Fans went onto the field. There were lots of protests, as you can see here. There's a There's a sign that says send short to Texas and keep the Senators. But that game was a forfeit. The second one would be 10-cent beer night, and we'll get to the third one a little later on. The Rangers were almost as bad as the Indians at that point. Mike Shropshire covered the team for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and he wrote a book about his experience covering the Texas Rangers. He called it Seasons in Hell. The Rangers had a really interesting succession of managers. Ted Williams was hired to manage the Senators in 1969. He went with the team to Washington. He was to Texas. He was actually kind of checked out at that point. And they hired Whitey Herzog. And Whitey Herzog at the time was still a little disgruntled about being passed over for being the Mets manager. He was a coach for the Mets when Gil Hodges died, and they instead elevated Yogi Berra to be the manager of the team. So Whitey Herzog went out to Texas, and he was the manager there for a little more than a year before Billy Martin became available. Like I said, Billy Martin was one of those guys who never met a fight he could walk away from. And he was a brilliant manager. He was a brilliant tactician. Mike Hargrove said he was one of the smartest guys he'd ever been around in a dugout. But he had a tendency of wearing out his welcome everywhere he went. 1969, he led the Minnesota Twins to a division title, the first year of divisional play. And he was gone after the following year. He was then hired in Detroit, led the Tigers to a division title, and he was gone the following year because he kept getting into fights, both at the Lindell AC across the street from Tiger Stadium and in at least one instance with one of his players. Bob Short was a big fan of Billy Martin and said, I would fire my grandmother for a chance to hire Billy Martin, which prompted Whitey Herzog to say, I guess I'm grandma. And Billy Martin was actually only in Texas for a couple of years, too. He won Manager of the Year in 1974. Didn't win a division title. That was actually the only team that Billy Martin managed at where he didn't win at least a division title. But he was fired there as well. And that, of course, led to his return to the Yankees, which led to all of his other departures and returns in New York as well. So basically, we had a very rich stew bubbling up the night of June 4th. There was obviously a heated rivalry, at least at that point in time, between these two teams. If you are one of the people who believes in that kind of thing, it was a full moon. It was the beginning of June, so school was letting out for the year, and college students were coming back home to Cleveland. And of course, beer was 10 cents a cup, far removed from the regular price of 65 cents. And here is Billy Martin blowing kisses to a crowd that was already irate by the time it got to the ballpark. Mike Shropshire said it was a bad mixture of alcohol, adrenaline, and testosterone. He said that there were people who were drunk and looking for a fight on the train to the stadium. So obviously it was one of those nights where it felt like a lot could happen and none of it would be good. Things actually started out relatively innocuously, but it sounded like there were a lot of people it was a bigger than usual crowd, and a lot of people who worked for the team said, yeah, and there weren't a lot of regulars there. When the crowds were that small, they knew the fans, and those weren't the people who were showing up that night. People were already showing up in various states of impairment. I talked to at least one player and at least one umpire who said they got a contact high on the field because people were smoking weed in the stands. There was some streaking going on because it was the 70s, and I'm told that was a thing then. You can see this was one of them. He was in so much of a hurry that he forgot to take off his last sock. There were a father and son that ran out to second base between innings and mooned the crowd. There was a woman who ran down onto the field and tried to kiss one of the umpires. It was general shenanigans. But as the night went on, the crowd got drunker and rowdier. As you can see here, you had a lot of people standing on the dugout. Worse than that, they were actually throwing firecrackers into the dugout. I don't know how many of you have been to Cleveland Stadium, but they didn't have a real bullpen per se. The warm-up mounds were right next to the dugout, and it got to the point where Pitchers, if they were coming in relief, were not even warming up there. They would go directly out to the pitcher's mound and throw their warm-up pitches there. Players' wives and girlfriends were sitting in the stands, and they were escorted out around the 6th inning. There was also an element of self-selection, too. There were a lot of fans who realized that something bad was going to happen, and so they left. There were actually people that worked there who realized something bad was going to happen, and they left. And the people who stuck around were the ones who may or may not have been kind of impaired in their judgment. Mike Hargrove was playing first base that night for the Rangers, and he said that somebody threw a gallon jug of wine at him. And he said he kicked it over to the side in the hopes that one of the grounds crew would pick it up. But he realized that somebody in the stands had picked it up and taken it back into the stands. And he said, that's when I started to get worried, because I was afraid I was going to see it again. But it was turning into a hell of a game. The Indians were down at one point 5-9 or 5-1. In the bottom of the 9th, it was 5-3. Manager Ken Asperani sent up 3 straight pinch hitters. Every one of them got a hit. And all of a sudden, it was a tie game. And somebody got the idea of jumping down into right field and trying to take Jeff Burroughs' baseball cap. And now fans had been jumping down onto the field between innings all game. They'd been running from foul pole to foul pole between innings. But this fan jumped down and tried to take Jeff Burroughs' cap. The fan fell down. Jeff Burroughs fell down. And from the dugout, Billy Martin looked out and said, that guy attacked my right fielder. We have to go and get him. And so then the Rangers ran out onto the field. I was told Billy Martin pulled a bat out of the dugout, said we have to go get our boy, and led what was called the Charge of the Light Brigade. Now, at this point, the Indians realized that things were going horribly, horribly awry, and they realized that the Rangers might actually get hurt out there. So they said, we are going to run out onto the field as well. And then, before too long, everybody was on the field. It was a full-scale riot. There were thousands and thousands of people on the field. I asked Ken Asperani if he was concerned for his safety. In the heat of the moment, he said he was, but later on, with the benefit of a little hindsight, or the dulling of the sensation that comes with that much time, he says no, because I feel like there were a lot of people out on the field, but none of them were in any condition to really throw a punch. And it was just a full-on mess. All the bases got stolen. People were running around on the field. The police were called in to restore order. They were unable to do that. And the game was declared a forfeit in favor of the Rangers. The reaction, as expected, was aghast, and people were mortified. Wayne Minshew of the Atlanta Constitution said how utterly stupid, how insane, how disgusting. Dave Anderson called it the beer that made Cleveland infamous. Dick Young said crowds go there to tank up, not to watch baseball. What do the lords of baseball expect? This is Ted Bonda, who was the managing partner of the team at the time. He viewed it as a success. He said, we drew more people on a Tuesday night than we usually draw. In fact, I think they said it was twice the typical Tuesday night crowd, and he wanted to have it again. And Major League Baseball let him. A month later, they had another 10-cent beer night, but nobody remembers that one because nothing went wrong. It was they learned their lesson. They tripled security, and they limited you to 2 10-cent beers. After that, it was regular price. This is the game story the next day from the Cleveland Press, and I don't think you can read the lead to the story. It was so quiet you could hear the foam breaking down in your cup. It was actually a bigger crowd than the 10-cent beer night was in June. It was a great game, too. It was the Indians and the Athletics. It was the first of a 4-game series between the two teams, and it was Gaylord Perry and Catfish Hunter. The Athletics ended up winning that game, and the next night was Dick Bosman's no-hitter. I said that there were three big fan forfeits, forfeits in the 1970s that related to fans running on the field. One of them, the third one was Disco Demolition Night. One of the players I talked to for my story for Cleveland Magazine on this, which I will put in the comments afterward, said, yeah, 10-cent beer night. I mean, none of us thought it was going to be a bad night because everybody was doing it. Disco Demolition Night seemed like it was a bad idea from the outset. The premise was exactly what it sounded like. If you brought a disco record, you got in for 98 cents. And all the records were collected and would be blown up between games of a doubleheader. 10-cent beer night drew 25,000 people in a stadium built for more than 80,000. In fact, they said that for boxing matches, it could accommodate up to 100,000. Comiskey Park attendance on Disco Demolition Night was estimated anywhere from 50,000 to 60,000. Nobody has a really good number on that because the turnstiles literally spun off their stands because of so many people coming in. And supposedly there was another 10,000 fans who were outside. They were unable to collect all the disco records. And the ones they didn't collect started getting thrown around like frisbees during the game and between games. But they were taken out to this little like box out in the outfield. And Milt Wilcox was by then with the Detroit Tigers, who were the opponents for the day. And he was going to pitch in the second game. And he went out into the outfield and he was warming up. And he said, yeah, they blew up the disco records. And he said he could feel it in his rib cage. He says, I don't know what they used, but they used too much of it. And a concussion almost knocked me down. And at that point, like 10-cent beer night, fans ran on the field. Bill Veeck, who was the owner of the White Sox, got on the PA system and tried to restore order. There was no way order was going to be restored. And that game ended up being a forfeit for the Tigers. But like Bruce Springsteen said, someday we'll look back on this and it will all seem funny. And that's kind of what happened with 10-cent beer night. It acquired a reputation. Like I said, hundreds of thousands of people now claim that they were at it. Tim Russert, he of Meet the Press, was at the game. He said, I went there with $2. You do the math. Drew Carey, who is a Cleveland native, said he had a friend who was at the game, and he said he got hit on the head with a beer bottle, and he bragged about it for years afterwards. In the 1990s or in the early 2000s, Homage started making T-shirts about 10-cent beer night. This was the one that they made for the 50th anniversary. But they said it was kind of interesting. They said we didn't have licensing initially, so we tried to do a lot of events that had a certain amount of fan credibility, like real fans recognize it. But at the same time, we could sell them without having to get a license. And one of them was the Pine Tar game between the Royals and the Yankees. One of them was the Bean Brawl between the Padres and the Braves. And one of them was 10-cent beer night in Cleveland. And to this day, it still has one of those reputations as one of those things that you had to be there. And one of those things where a lot of people do claim to be there. This is but one of many weird moments in Cleveland sports that I have written about for my book, Weird Moments in Cleveland Sports, available wherever fine works of literature can be sold. That is the extent of my presentation. I will happily entertain any questions you may have at this point.
Thanks, Vince. It was as much fun second time around. Thank you very much.
I'm delighted to hear that.
Yeah. I was at a 50-cent beer night at the Quad Cities, and as the game was going on, they were getting, you buy the containers that hold 4 beers, and they carry the 4. So by the end of the game, the public address announcer is basically keeping track of how many of these that people were stacking up. Who knows what was going on in the ball game? Well, there goes someone with 4 of them. He's got 6 of them. So yeah, they're carrying these, they're spilling them all over. And so as we got into the bottom of the ninth, I went and stood as close to an entrance as I could. So as soon as the game was over, I could run out and get in the car and get out of the parking lot. So yeah.
Yes, that
But
seems
not
like
as
a
dangerous
really
as
good idea.
what you talked about. Yeah.
Well,
Any questions?
Milwaukee is so similar to Cleveland, and so we used to sell, County Stadium used to sell buckets of beer. And do you remember that, Dennis? Yeah.
Yeah.
And people would stack them on their heads, and it never got crazy though. But I don't know how much they were. But
Well, there was one, it's kind of funny. There was one incident where there was a 10-cent beer night in Milwaukee that resulted in a few fights. Obviously nothing on the level of what would happen in Cleveland, but you know, it was definitely the kind of thing that gave people pause about, you know, whether or not this was a good idea. I mean, not enough that they actually said, no, we don't want to do this, because that's the other thing too. The Indians were desperate. One of the people I talked to for this Cleveland Magazine feature was Tom Bonda, whose father was Ted Bonda, the owner of the team, and he said that they could actually sit up in the team offices, which was in one of the top floors at Cleveland Stadium, and actually watch. They counted the crowds coming over the bridge to the baseball game.
You know, in your intro about beer and how baseball, it was important to baseball. I'm not sure if you're aware, Vince, that at Milwaukee County Stadium in the Milwaukee Braves days, you could bring your own beer in, and people would buy a ticket to put their case of beer on the seat next to them.
I feel like you talked about that when we were in Minneapolis.
Yeah. And the other part of that was, so then the county, like 1961, wanted to cancel that. And of course, they blamed the Braves, and that actually became one of the reasons why people quit going to attend the Braves games, because they felt the Braves made the decision where the county did. And I'm sure the Braves probably had some input on that decision, but and it only lasted like a month. But that people remember saying you can't bring your own beer in for years and years and years.
Well, that's like the there's no drinking in the Muni lot before Browns games.
In your butt.
Meanwhile, somewhere I've seen at least one picture of somebody hitting a beer bong, and a Cleveland cop is the one that's holding up the funnel.
Vince, this is Larry Baldessaro in Milwaukee. I really enjoyed your presentation at SABR, and this one was even more expensive. So thank you for doing it. But
My pleasure.
I just wanted to say one thing. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to interview Ken Aspromonte, the manager at the time. And I asked him about 10-cent beer night, and he talked about bringing his team out to help the Tigers. To help the
Rangers.
Texas. Anyway, he said we had 50 ball players fighting about 1,000 hoodlums, and we knocked them down like they were bowling pins. They were so drunk. He said the umpires waited about an hour, and then I lost the forfeited game because it was just ridiculous. He thought it was foolish from the start, but he said it was just ridiculous. And then he said about Billy Martin. Billy thanked me for helping him out by bringing out my team.
Yes.
He sent me a bottle of scotch. No big surprise there. Then he concluded by saying, we were friends before, but after that, we were like brothers.
I feel like they played somewhere in the minor leagues together.
Get out. There you go. Chrissy, I love you. No, I'm not
The police were obviously overwhelmed with these, I guess you could say riots, but what were the attempts to Were there any attempts to arrest or prosecute fans?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because Cleveland also prides itself as being home to the first rock concert, the Moondog Coronation Ball at the old Cleveland Arena on Euclid Avenue in the 50s, and that was that essentially ended prematurely due to a riot there too. But there was a common thread in what I have heard about that and what I have heard about 10 Cent Beer Night is that there was really no law enforcement presence there. They kind of relied on the ticket takers and ushers to keep order, and they were not prepared for what happened. But one of the people I talked to for this Cleveland Magazine story was a Cleveland police officer, and he said, we got a phone call, or we got a call over the radio. All units proceed to Cleveland Stadium for a riot. He said, we came up off the Shoreway on East 9th Street, right by the stadium, and two naked women ran out in front of the car. And he said, oh, it's going to be that kind of a riot. And he said, we tried to just kind of keep the peace as best we could and make sure nobody hurt themselves. I believe 9 people were charged related to 10 Cent Beer Night. I couldn't tell you about the disposition of any of those cases, though.
And I guess it would have been the middle of the night before they ever got order really restored around the stadium. Was that correct?
It was probably a good solid hour. One of the players told me that they kind of stayed in the clubhouse and waited it out until the game was officially forfeited. And he said you could just hear it roaring out there.
One of the things is that at these baseball games, you don't want to give fans some kind of promotion that they can abuse. For example, it's not abusing, but back in 1973 and 74, I went to a couple of Portland Beavers games where they had free hot dog night. Now, that's just absolutely fine. Everybody loved it. And then a while later, I went to a game in Miller Park where not Miller Park, County Stadium. And just to show you how long ago this was, they were giving away records. They were 45 RPM size records, although they were 33 RPM. But then during the game, people started throwing those, like you said, Vince,
like frisbees, yes.
And I was worried that they'd hit some player in the eye or something with that. So that wasn't very well thought out. And in college, I played tournament chess, and in chess, you're always trying to anticipate what's going to happen after you make your move.
Yes.
And so it seems to me with these things you're explaining, demolition day and so forth. How could this not be thought out any better than it was? I mean, can't people see that 10 Cent Beer Night can turn into something like this, or some other promotions can explode? Why, Vince, do you think that these things aren't better thought out?
Well, like I said, to that point, it hadn't been. I mean, they obviously this is the opposite of what they tell you with your 401k, and they thought that past behaviors were predictive of future results. Because they had never had an issue, they didn't think they were going to have an issue. And it was, and unfortunately, this was one of those things that was rife for abuse, because they said this was one of those instances where they did not cap how many beers you could buy. I think they just limited it to how many you could carry, and I think it was like 4 or 6 at one time. And there was a story that they had actually set up one of the trucks out beyond the outfield fence, and they were overrun. I mean, there were so many people there that the vendors were overwhelmed. Ended up being a couple of those people who said something bad's going to happen and we don't want to be a part of it. And I have heard stories that there were actually some of those taps that were effectively self-serve, which I'm sure did nobody any favors.
These days, I think clubs have figured out that you shouldn't give fans things that they can throw. In fact, maybe that the beer can't be carried into the ballparks anymore because they're worried that people are going to throw cans or bottles that are filled with beer.
Well, it's funny you bring that up because one of the other weird moments in Cleveland sports that I cover in my book was an incident at a Browns game in 2001. To this day, it is referred to as Bottlegate, and that's the game where the Browns were driving. They were trying to score to win the game. It was about a minute and a half left. They didn't have any timeouts. Tim Couch threw what everybody thought was a completed pass on 4th down. For a 1st down, sticks got moved. He took the snap on the ensuing play, spiked the ball, and all of a sudden the referees huddled up, and everybody said, the concern, at least immediately, was that it was that he had committed intentional grounding. But what happened was that the referees said that 4th down play was actually an incomplete pass. The Browns turned the ball over on downs, and Jacksonville had essentially won the game. And at that point, thousands and thousands of fans registered their displeasure with that decision by throwing things onto the field. And it was they were throwing bottles and they were throwing cans. And there's a great picture of all of the detritus on the field. But what's really funny is it ends up being, they ended up bringing everybody in, both teams, and declaring the game over until the league office called and said, "Hey, you can't do that. That's the you can't call the game over without the clock hitting zeros." And so they ended up coming out and Jacksonville knelt down, I don't know, 3 or 4 times to run out the clock. And that was kind of the end of that. And once again, everybody was mortified except in Cleveland. The Browns management and ownership said, well, I think this is a sign of the passion of our fan base.
Was Mike Veck was it SABR 50 in Baltimore? I'm trying to think where he was.
He was in
He was talking
Chicago
about
last year.
Okay, and he was talking about how it was his idea. His dad let him run with it. It was a disaster.
Him and Steve Dahl, yes.
And he's famous for this. Everybody knows it's almost like he's wearing it as a badge of honor because he came up with this great idea. And he's been a genius with baseball ever since. So, yeah.
Well, actually, what he had said is, I saw him in Chicago a couple of years ago. He said that his old man ended up taking the bullet for him, and Mike said he was at least for like the next decade or so kind of persona non grata in organized baseball. It wasn't until he got back in with the St. Paul Saints, an independent team, that he really started to prove himself again. But again, now, yeah, like you said, he is it's taken on a little more historic significance and a little more people regard it a little more warmly now than they might have in the cold light of day immediately afterward.
Didn't we have a problem with you're talking about throwing things on the field where there was they gave away baseballs and a lot of them ended up on the field. Fans just kept throwing them on there.
That was a Dodgers game, yes, and that I believe is still the last forfeit.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Do you ever have
I
anything
seem to
exciting like that
recall.
in football?
I'm sorry?
You don't get anything exciting like that in football.
Well, I accepted Browns games, apparently.
Yeah. Yeah. They have one. Baseball got oodles. So, yeah.
So I don't know if I'm missing something, but there were other 10-cent beer nights. So why did this one go so off the rails?
That's a really good question. And
Mhm.
and I feel like it is it was just at the right time, at the right place. Like I said, there was a crowd whipped up into a frenzy. There were a lot of people who were not there to watch the game. And everything just kind of went sideways. There's a show, I don't know if you guys watch the History Channel at all, but there's a show called Engineering Disasters. And I've watched it, and I really enjoy watching it. And it's kind of a morbid fascination because, I mean, we're talking about some serious, serious disasters. Like they're talking about the Challenger explosion and the Coconut Grove fire and all of these terrible things that have happened in history. But there is a common theme to it, that for one big thing to go wrong in a big way, a lot of little things have to go wrong along the way. And I feel like that's kind of what happened here. There was a fight a week earlier. There were a lot of people who were out for blood in Cleveland about it. Beer was 10 cents a cup, and there was no limit on how much beer you could have. It got to the point where, people, like I said, were showing up drunk or high to the stadium. And, it was just one bad thing after another until we got to really bad things.
And thank you for the Lenny
Um,
Randall at bat footage. That's super funny.
I thought so too.
I wonder if anything, this is probably going a little bit off maybe speculation, into speculation, but the fact that it was in the 70s and the society was a little bit more, it turned years before, I guess, into Woodstock, all the other things that happened where you had mass gatherings. And I know there were issues in baseball going back into the 30s with riots and things like, what was it, Joe Medwick and the Tigers in the World Series. But do you think it could have had to have anything to do with the fact that in this time frame of society, it was getting a little bit, people were getting a little more, we'll go out and drink, we'll do this, we'll do that. I don't want to make it sound like society was falling apart or anything, but it changed, I think, after, say, from 1960 to 1980, there was a change in how public behavior sometimes occurred. I don't know whether that's valid or not, but that just did cross my mind.
And I'm sure that's part of it. I mean, and I feel like it is not a stretch to say that there is this idea that, there were a lot of people who did think society was kind of coming apart at the seams. And it was particularly prevalent in Cleveland. Cleveland in 1950 had a population approaching 1 million people. And little by little, a lot of small things happened that ended up making a big difference. In the 1970s, no city in the United States lost a greater percentage of its population than Cleveland did. I think New York actually lost more in terms of raw numbers, but New York was a significantly larger city. In 1966, there were riots in the Huff. In 1968, there was a shootout between militants and police officers in Glenville. Cleveland was in the very nascent stages in 1974 of a mob war, which would really come to a head in 76 and 77. So, you know, it was kind of a wild time in Cleveland. And there was actually a very popular T-shirt of that era, T-shirts and stickers of the Cleveland skyline, and it said, "Cleveland, you've got to be tough."
Mhm. Yeah.
I think that's interesting, Francis. There, you know, there's probably some connection to that. To some extent, there's an attitude, you know, or probably some certain group of young people, probably young males who thought, you know, this is an opportunity. So,
Yeah.
it's
Of course,
reasonable.
I guess there wasn't any social media then, or this thing could have really gotten out of hand if it had been, you know, everybody come to the stadium, there's a riot going on.
And that's the thing. It was not on. The game was on the radio. It was not televised. I think that at that point they were only televising 10 to 15 games a year. So there was some inkling that this was going on while it was going on, but you know, obviously not as much as there would be had this game occurred even 20 years later.
Yeah.
I think you might have had a little Billy Martin factor going on too, the way it sounded.
Oh, no doubt.
He seemed to be pretty good at baiting crowds. I know he did the same thing with Milwaukee fans with the Brewers. So
Mhm.
I'm sure there was no love lost for Billy Martin in there.
Chinese aviators. Am I trying to remember? Is that the term he used or something?
Yeah, Chinese aviators, I
Yeah,
believe.
yeah. So. Any other questions for Vince? Vince, this was fun again. Thank you very much. Yeah,
I'm glad to
I
hear that.
I say that a little selfishly that, you know, and I enjoy one of the presentations. I want to see it again, and so I book it and hope everybody else likes it as much as I did. So, but I appreciate this greatly.
It does seem fairly well received, and I appreciate you all.
Yeah, good.
No,
Thank you.
yeah, it was very good.
Yeah, cool. Well, I'm going to turn off the recording